Is it Mr. Marquis? Marquis, I'm sorry, Mr. Marquis. I bet it was Marquis once.
It was once. Thank you very much, my lady. Along with Catherine Newton-Casey, I represent the Frontline Migrant Health Workers Group. We are instructed by the Public Interest Law Centre. I propose to summarise our written submissions to give an overview of the group's work in the care sector and then make some submissions on scope that follow on from their experience. First of all, the group would like to thank the inquiry for including them in this module, but also for the particular inclusion of home care within the module's scope. The group is a collective of two trade unions, the United Voices of the World and the Independent Workers of Great Britain, and a community consortium, Kanlungan. Kanlungan is a charitable organisation consisting of several Filipino and Southeast Asian community groups. They work for the welfare and interests of migrants, refugees and diaspora communities from Southeast Asia in the UK. Their members work across the care sector, including nurses, non-clinical staff and home carers. IWGB and UVW are non-TUC affiliated trade unions with memberships in several sectors, including the social care sector. Their members work as care workers, cleaners and kitchen staff, often in outsourced gig economy positions. Group members are overwhelmingly working class, in low-paid and precarious employment. The majority of the social care members are women and migrant and/or ethnic minority workers. As such, they fall within the protected characteristics of the Equality Act. However, the group wishes to emphasise at the outset that systemic issues such as outsourced employment are applicable across the working class, regardless of ethnicity and gender. Most members work outside of the NHS and local authority care homes in the privatised care sector. Many work in the informal care sector in private homes. In the first months of the pandemic, as government tried to free up capacity, hospitals were forced to discharge patients into the care sector. The government's policies ensured that patients were discharged without testing or isolation into care homes that were populated by the clinically vulnerable and staffed by the most disadvantaged of workers. An underfunded NHS was effectively told to shunt the problem elsewhere. Care workers were placed under immense pressure to meet the needs that the healthcare system could not meet. Pre-pandemic, 61% of care sector workers were employed by private providers, with just 7% by local authorities and 6% by the NHS. The average public sector pay was around £10 an hour. The average private sector pay was around £8.40, which is below the living wage. There is a heavy reliance on outsourced workers, particularly in the private sector, where a full third of social care jobs were classified as insecure. Home care workers, that figure was 56% on 0 hours contracts. Almost a quarter of the national care sector workforce are from ethnic minority backgrounds, rising to 70% in London, and 82% nationally of social care workers are women. It cannot have come to any surprise to anyone that in May 2020, the ONS were reporting that care workers were among the occupations at the highest risk of death. Historically, the main social determinant of health inequality is income. The poorer you are, the more precarious your employment, the more exposed you are, and the more likely you are to die. Care sector workers are some of the lowest paid workers in the country, even when they have the benefit of an employment contract. Outsourced workers, without the contractual protection needed to demand safer conditions from their employers, were at even greater risk. Migrant care workers were all the more vulnerable. When immigration status is tied to employment, you cannot refuse unreasonable demands from employers without losing both your job and your home. Migrant workers who were undocumented had no protection at all. In care homes, the two major pandemic issues were understaffing and PPE. Understaffing was chronic pre-pandemic. and evidently a lack of sufficient staff leads to unsafe workplaces, and this was inevitably exacerbated when the virus ripped through the care sector. A key feature of the gig economy is that workers had to work in multiple care homes, filling gaps caused by understaffing and sickness. The very nature of their employment made them vectors of the virus. The causes of understaffing are multifaceted. Low pay and insecure employment are plainly major considerations. Outsourced workers in the private sector often put pre-Covid understaffing down to profit margins. As one member put it, it's about profit rather than proper care. Whatever the reasons, an understaffed sector cannot be resilient to a pandemic. The government's post-pandemic response to understaffing was to issue employment-linked visas to 70,000 overseas workers in 2023, in effect outsourcing the problem internationally and subsidising the cost of care in the UK through low wages. This doesn't address the problem, and in the context of the government's hostile environment policies, it creates precisely the subclass of worker that group members have reported, and some examples. Migrant workers being disproportionately allocated to higher risk environments, unable to object because of their immigration status being dependent on...
I'm sorry to interrupt, Mr. Markey, but... sorry, Marcus. But I've got to be really careful in what I'm addressing. I have terms of reference. I cannot change the whole of society. My terms of reference relate to the pandemic and the response, the preparedness for, which we've done in Module 1 to a large extent, and response to. And I'm afraid, trespassing on areas where I cannot go. The other area I cannot go are party politics. So if you could please just focus on the issues that I'm addressing in this module, I'd be extremely grateful.
Well, my lady, these workers that I'm just referring to were disproportionately allocated to higher risk environments. And that
I understand, but if you could make sure it is related to care, the care sector and the pandemic. Some of your remarks sounded a bit more general. Maybe I misunderstood. I'm sorry if I did.
I'm trying to set the scene, my lady, but I'll continue and I'll endeavour to stay as close to the scope as possible. Workers in the care sector who had no recourse to public funds, conditions applied to their visas, found themselves destitute in the event of sickness and fearful of seeking medical treatment, including testing and vaccination, due to the risk of medical charges and immigration consequences. Sick workers with work-dependent immigration statuses were often pressured to return to work in order to cover staff shortages. On PPE, group members report a total lack of PPE in care homes at the outset of the pandemic, leaving them unprotected when hospital patients were discharged into their care. A single example, at a nursing home in North London, UVW workers took to making their own masks by laminating pieces of plastic and fixing them around their heads with elastic sourced from their leggings. When employed staff were provided with PPE, outsourced staff were often forced to work without the same protection. When PPE was provided, it was frequently in the face of employer intransigence, often of a lower standard, ill-fitting, and provided without guidance on use. There are frequent examples, which I've put within our written submissions, of care staff raising concerns about mismanagement that in part came about as a result of infrastructure issues and in part came about as a result of accountability issues. We also have examples of outsourced workers reporting employers refusing to pay sick pay. The inadequacy of statutory sick pay led to sick workers facing destitution, or in some cases facing no option but to continue to work even whilst they were ill. Home care workers make up a large cohort of Canlungan's members. Many have employment-dependent immigration status. A large proportion have irregular immigration status and are informally employed without contracts. Their roles often involve giving complex care to vulnerable people. During the pandemic, home care workers were overexposed through a lack of PPE, but also through an expectation to continue working and to continue caring when either they or their employers were infected with the virus. These workers were invisible to national statistics and so did not inform the significantly higher infection and subsequently mortality rates in ethnic minority communities. They faced the same issues as their outsourced and documented colleagues, but with the additional burden of the immigration policies that I was referring to earlier. And some examples, because they are important, my lady. The wages of the outsourced staff was significantly lower than that I've referred to, of the undocumented staff, sorry, than that I've referred to previously. The effectively undocumented workers working in no work and no pay positions, transient and crowded housing, making it all the more difficult to stay safe from the virus. The group's members experienced the strain, grief and fear of their colleagues and patients. They cared for residents who should have been in hospital, and they were with them, of course, when they died. They did so whilst exposed and unprotected themselves, taking the virus back home to their own families when they finished work, and they did that on a wage that cannot be lived on, in work that is wrongly considered to be menial. In the words of one member, I don't need claps, I need proper PPE and dignified pay. So, my lady, in terms of the scope, we appreciate that the scope is provisional and dependent on the Rule 9 requests. We ask, when making those requests, that the inquiry consider the experience of the group's membership and ensures that that informs the subsequent list of issues. We endorse what many others have said this morning on the pre-pandemic period in respect of understaffing. This aspect of the pandemic state of social, the pre-pandemic state of social care is fundamental to understanding the impact on the sector. Understaffing, pay, conditions and underfunding are historic problems, and the analysis has to be able to explore that history. The Point 2 analysis must look at pay and conditions and the percentage of workers in precarious employment across the whole sector and as a comparison between the public and private sectors. And should we say, look at the rationale for placing key workers such as these in these positions of precarious employment? The structural analysis should examine the percentage of staff from migrant backgrounds with visas linked to their employment. And in respect of the home care sector, an analysis of the extent to which that is regulated and, where possible, estimates of the contribution of undocumented workers to the sector over the pandemic period. Finally, my lady, point 3, the scopes point 3. We say that this analysis must include the consideration given to the impact on staff and the particular need to protect them, given that they were in the most deprived quintiles of the working population. That evaluation should extend to specific categories of staff who were all the more vulnerable due to precarious employment and their immigration statuses. Bearing in mind the proportion of care staff from ethnic minority backgrounds, the analysis must include the consideration of staff who had been made vulnerable by hostile environment policies. Lastly, on points 4 and 8, when expert evidence is sought in respect of infection control, we ask for it to include 2 things. First, evidence on the surface transmission time of the virus and the impact of that on the cleaning staff, given that they were the first line of infection control and the last in line for PPE. And secondly, an analysis of the failure of PPE supply chains and an exploration as to why PPE was not available for care sector staff. So those, my lady, are our preliminary submissions.
Thank you very much, Mr Marquis. And I'm sorry for interrupting you. I may have misunderstood you, as I said. Thank you. Right. Mr Peter. Ah, there you are.
My lady, I represent the National Association of Care and Support Workers, or NACAS for short. I'm here today with Paul Featherstone, who is NACAS's founder and sits to my right. This is the first module in which NACAS has sought to participate in your inquiry as a core participant. With that in mind, and for the unfamiliar, NACAS is an independent professional body that advocates for care and support workers, promotes the recognition and value of their work, and provides its members with support, education and other resources, as it did during the pandemic. It is the only such organisation dedicated exclusively to care workers. It has an ethnically diverse membership, which consists of those working in the full range of adult social care roles, including within care homes and in home care, and the employed, self-employed, and those engaged on 0 hours contracts. NACAS is proud to be a core participant in this module and is grateful to your ladyship for giving care workers a distinct voice in Module 6. As a group, care workers are so often underrepresented in public life, and NACAS is committed to contributing to your ladyship's investigation. Care workers suffered the devastating impact of the pandemic acutely. The available data suggests that the mortality rates for those employed in social care were among, if not the highest, by occupation in the United Kingdom. That death rate was contributed to by a number of factors that make care workers generally more vulnerable, including their socio-economic status, immigration status, gender and race. Indeed, as compared to the general population, care workers are disproportionately from a black and minority ethnic background, and the vast majority are women. As the pandemic took hold, the conditions in which care workers worked, often to the point of exhaustion, to deliver vital services deteriorated from what was already a parlous state. With little or no training, care workers were required to adapt their heavy and emotionally challenging workloads to respond to those for whom they cared who may or were suffering from the virus. They often did so with no or limited access to PPE or testing, inadequate and ever-changing guidance on infection prevention and control, difficulties in evidencing their key worker status, and without access to sick pay. And that work also involved implementing what were heartbreaking do not resuscitate instructions and limitations on family visits. Such was the commitment to those for whom they cared. Some carers took the extraordinary step of separating themselves from their own families and moving into their places of work. My lady, considering the essential and difficult nature of their role, as recognised by so many of us as we clapped on our doorsteps, it is striking that care workers are not only overburdened in their tasks, but some of the most poorly paid in society. The low value put on care work, at least by reference to its apparent financial worth, is important, we say, to this inquiry because the available research suggests it contributed to, for example, understaffing and the need for carers to hold multiple jobs in different places, which in turn contributed to the response of the sector to the pandemic. And we are confident the inquiry will investigate all of the issues relevant to the impact of the pandemic on care workers, including what we think may prove to be uneven impacts depending on factors such as employment status. My lady, our written submissions focused on the proposed scope of Module 6, and we adopt those submissions and indeed the submissions of the core participants that have gone before us. From a care worker's perspective, we would encourage your ladyship to consider the pre-pandemic state of adult social care in a number of areas because in NACAS's experience, and as the available research suggests, the dire state of many of the systems underpinning the adult social care sector had a significant bearing on the response of that sector to the pandemic. We think such consideration will be of critical importance to your ladyship's recommendations to strengthen the response of the sector to a future pandemic. And simply put, the position of the sector the day before the pandemic struck cannot be disentangled from what happened on the day when it began. Many of the points have already been made by others before me, but may I just highlight 5 key points affecting care workers that we would invite the inquiry to explore. The first is structure, and whether the structure of the adult social care sector affected the response. This includes whether sporadic funding arrangements impacted on strategic planning and robustness of the sector, including capacity. It also includes whether different business models, including publicly funded, small-scale, large-scale private funded and highly financialised care home providers led to variable investment in staff and infrastructure, and whether that had an impact. And we adopt the submission made by the Covid-19 Bereaved Families for Justice about spotlighting different settings. We suggest that could include private and public settings. There is evidence to suggest where there was better investment that may have led to better outcomes during the pandemic. It also includes consideration of whether the fragmented nature of services had an impact, particularly in England and Wales, where health and social care sectors are not integrated as they are in Scotland and Northern Ireland. The second point is systemic issues affecting care workers, some of which I have touched upon and which may have contributed to the pandemic response, including pay, working conditions, workloads, the insecurity of employment, the lack of training, low staff retention, high turnover rates, the absence of professional regulation, and the low status attributed by some to the work of caring. The third point is the position of care workers in relation to policies and guidance, and whether their position was given adequate and timely consideration when policies such as the one to discharge untested patients from hospitals into care settings, and guidance such as in relation to testing and infection prevention and control, whether the position of care workers was considered when they were being developed, communicated and implemented. And that includes consideration of whether any such consideration and the resultant policies and guidance took into account the diverse range of roles fulfilled by care workers, including the position of the employed and self-employed, the latter of whom were less able to access PPE, testing and financial support. And it also includes consideration of whether those determining policy and guidance took into account the complexity of the sector, including its infrastructure and the ability of smaller organisations to implement ever-evolving requirements. The fourth point is the support that was available to care workers of all statuses and whether it was adequate, bearing in mind the obvious risks of transmission to those for whom they cared. And the fifth point, and I'm grateful for the indication from your council this morning on this topic, whether appropriate consideration was given to the impact on care workers of the mandatory nature of vaccination requirements and what alternative approaches might work in a future pandemic. My lady, as to experts, we think the inquiry may benefit from expert evidence on a number of the issues we've identified. We adopt what has been said before, and we would be grateful, as others have suggested, to be told of who the inquiry proposes to instruct so we may contribute to that discussion. Disclosure, finally, my lady. Like other CPs, we invite disclosure as early as possible to assist us to prepare. As a new core participant in your ladyship's inquiry, we have asked your team to assist us with what evidence from other earlier modules, including oral evidence, we should be familiar with. We note a number of CPs have cited such evidence in their submissions to you today, and we are grateful for the indication from your team about it. We would be grateful to have that as soon as possible so we can get up to speed as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pater. Very grateful. Ms. Morris.
My lady, on behalf of the Royal College of Nursing, may I make first some submissions on the issue of scope, which are intended to be focused. We submit that the issue of what aspects of the social care sector require to be considered by the inquiry are essential, require to be addressed at this stage. The College submits that the question, what was the impact on the social care sector, can only be addressed in the light of the characteristics of the sector at the time. So to adopt and build on the submissions of Mr. Friedman KC, that the system buckled when the crisis began, we say that the appropriate analogy is perhaps of a hammer hitting a wall. A weak structure, which we say was the case with the social care sector at the beginning of the pandemic, will buckle, but a robust one will not. In that case, what characteristics of the social care sector made it weak so that it buckled under the impact of the pandemic and require further investigation by the inquiry? First of all, we echo the submissions of many of the core participants that it was a lack of adequate staffing. Secondly, another key characteristic was the poor relation status of the social care sector as against the healthcare. And we say that affected outcomes in a number of critical domains. First of all, there was a lack of access to adequate equipment, such as PPE and testing. And secondly, the decision to move patients from hospitals to social care without due regard for the effects of that. Thus, we say what requires to be investigated is that lack of adequate staffing, lack of adequate equipment, and the inflection of the decision-making process. Staying with the issue of staffing, almost 7% of nursing posts in the social care sector were unfilled at the start of the pandemic. Of those who were working, their ability to work was affected by their own COVID infection and a need to shield. That meant that pressures on those working were intensified, ultimately leading to moral distress and sometimes psychological injury. In consequence, there are ongoing shortages in nursing provision, particularly in the social care sector, and that is increasing that sector's vulnerability to a future pandemic. One solution which this inquiry is invited to consider by the college is that there is legislation in this country that imposes accountability on central government for workforce planning and supply as a key recommendation of the inquiry, and we submit that should form part of Module 6. Thirdly, since infection was so poorly controlled in social care settings, the Royal College of Nursing reminds the inquiry of its request in the preliminary hearing for Module 3 that the inquiry seek from all the relevant bodies a full suite of infection prevention and control guidance for the period, a chronology of when it was issued, by whom, and how it was disseminated, because that the college submits is a further key aspect of how, as it's been put today, COVID ripped through the social care sector. Finally, and in addition to its written submissions, having heard the submissions of Mr. Friedman KC, the college also adopts his submission that Rule 9 questionnaires include the question, what would you recommend for future pandemic planning? And that witnesses attend prepared to answer that key question, given the vital purpose of the inquiry. That concludes my submissions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morris. Mr. Jacobs.
Good afternoon, my lady. These are the submissions of the Trades Union Congress. The TUC brings together over 5 million working people who make up its 48 member unions. Those affiliated unions with a particular interest in Module 6 include Unison, GMB and Unite, each of which represent a substantial number of those who work in the sector. The experiences of those who work in the sector and the experiences of those who rely on residential or domiciliary care are, my lady, two sides of the same coin. One depends on the other, and in that sense the TUC has an interest in the array of issues to be considered in this module. But of course it is upon the experiences of those who work in the sector upon which the TUC's input will be particularly focused. The challenges faced by those working in the sector were obviously significant, and some of the fault lines have already been canvassed in modules 1 and 2 and in submissions of others before you today, which I will not repeat. We were grateful to hear counsel to the inquiry in opening to note the 1.5 million who work in the sector in England alone and some of the characteristics of the workforce. These summary submissions will focus, my lady, on one point. It is the extent to which this module will need to consider, in the discharge of your terms of reference, some of the structural challenges facing the sector which pre-existed the pandemic. My lady, perhaps something of a theme in some of the submissions before you today. Counsel to the inquiry in their written note and again in submissions today describe that it is not part of the inquiry's terms of reference to consider the state of adult social care systems in the United Kingdom prior to the pandemic, save where necessary to understand how the pandemic impacted on adult social care. As a matter of principle, that is no doubt correct, but it begs an important question. To what extent is it necessary, in order to understand how the pandemic impacted on adult social care, to consider the state of adult social care systems prior to the pandemic? The TUC says that the inescapable reality, however messy and difficult it may be, is that the impact of the pandemic is a function of the state of the adult social care system going into it. The extraordinary challenges of the pandemic met with the challenges of a chronically underfunded and fragmented social care sector, delivered by many thousands of local authority and private care providers, with little central strategic direction, oversight and data, served by an understaffed, underpaid and undervalued workforce, many in insecure work. In an echo, I think of an observation made by Miss Campbell on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved this morning. These matters will be relevant not only to understanding the impact of the pandemic, but also to the making of meaningful recommendations. That is because, my lady, change cannot be achieved in a vacuum from these structural challenges. Your counsel to the inquiry addressed this issue this morning and said this: that it may be that the pandemic threw a harsh and painful light on issues such as pre-pandemic underfunding and the undervaluing of the adult social care sector, but Module 6 is focused on the impact of the pandemic, not on those wide-reaching and historic concerns and problems. And so in counsel to the inquiry submission, it is not therefore within Module 6's remit or scope to seek to fix or address those long-standing issues. My lady, that was a submission made entirely properly, of course, in recognition of the need to adhere carefully to your terms of reference. But respectfully, we say that it is mistaken. The place to which it may inadvertently lead is that it is not the function of this inquiry to fix the roof, but to focus on where best to place the buckets that catch the dropping water. That, my lady, would be a mistake. At the very least, we urge this module to gather the evidence and for you, my lady, to proceed with an open mind. The conclusion of a full and fearless inquiry might ultimately be that the roof needs to be fixed. That a problem is historic does not mean that it is not relevant to pandemic response, and it may mean that a recommendation addressing it is desperately needed. You cannot, my lady, as you observed just a few moments ago, fix all of society. But we do invite the funnel of your investigations to start broadly and not to cast some of the broader structural issues to one side for fear of them being too broad or having a political hue. They may prove to be centrally relevant. In a related point, it was observed by counsel to the inquiry that this module does not intend to repeat Module 1. Clearly it should not. But Module 1 considered resilience and preparedness up to the start of the pandemic, including in the social care sector. That leads to what is perhaps the most important and relevant of questions. How did those features of resilience and preparedness play out during the pandemic? In that sense, Module 1 must be a platform for this module. Module 1 need not be repeated, but its evidence and findings should be of core relevance, and we hope that that is what is envisaged. My lady, the structural challenges to which we invite your focus are set out in more detail at paragraphs 9A to 9J of our written submission. I do not repeat the detail of those matters here, but we invite careful consideration of them. In our written submissions, we do also make observations in respect of expert evidence, every story matters, and the important role of the evidence of frontline staff to this module. But on those matters, we stand behind our written submissions and do not repeat them here. My lady, unless I can assist further.
No, thank you very much, Ms Jacobs. Ms Curtin, I think you complete the submissions. Have you got a green light?
It's on.
Got you.
Thank you. My lady, Prynhawn Da, good afternoon. Hannah Curtin on behalf of the Welsh Government. The Welsh Government is grateful for the opportunity to participate in Module 6 and grateful for the opportunity to make these brief oral submissions. As in all other modules, the Welsh Government offers its full cooperation and support for your inquiry's work in examining the impact of the pandemic on the adult social care sector in Wales. My lady, the Welsh Government recognises that Module 6 will require the investigation of difficult questions. Service users of the care sector include some of the most vulnerable individuals in society, and the Welsh Government recognises the particular suffering and loss that was experienced by those individuals and by their loved ones during the pandemic. The Welsh Government would restate its deep sympathy to those who lost loved ones or who otherwise suffered during the pandemic. Similarly, the care sector was supported during the pandemic by the individuals who worked tirelessly and with great courage and dedication to continue to provide care to those who needed it. And that includes those individuals who were employed in the sector and unpaid carers and volunteers. The Welsh Government would restate its profound gratitude to those individuals for their committed service and for the many personal sacrifices that were required to continue to work under that exceptional strain. It is entirely right that Module 6 should examine both the experience of those individuals and the broad range of decisions that were taken by the Welsh Government and by others in relation to the management of the pandemic in the care sector. The Welsh Government would emphasise that it fully recognises the importance of that scrutiny, and indeed it welcomes that scrutiny, which will enable lessons to be learned for the future. The Welsh Government is committed to providing every assistance that it can to the inquiry to allow for that investigation to take place. My lady, diolch, thank you.
Thank you, Ms Curtin. Anything by way of response?
Only this, my lady. Whether it's a leaky roof or a structurally weak wall, the scale of Module 6 task listening to today's submissions is unenviable. And I know that you will want to consider the eloquent and thoughtful submissions you heard with real care. All raise important matters and provide you with much to think about. But that must be balanced as against the very real need to focus on the key issues and the key recommendations and the competing demands, not just within Module 6, but across the inquiry as a whole. And so I've no doubt that you will in due course issue a determination to the core participants once you've had a chance to think about all that's been said today and written.
Thank you very much, Ms Carey. I think no more construction analogies.
No.
Thank you all very much indeed. I want to repeat my thanks. The submissions today have been very constructive and instructive. And as Ms Carey says, I shall consider them all with great care. I should also like to commend the entire team for their timekeeping. I think you are the first module list of participants who managed to come in under time rather than over time. So thank you all very much for being so efficient and focused. And as I say, as Ms Carey says, I shall issue a determination once I've had a chance to consider all the matters that you've raised. Thank you very much. I think the next substantive hearing is Belfast on April the 30th, but I think I may have another preliminary hearing before then. Thank you all.
All rise.